In the annals of forgotten empires, there are names that echo faintly, like whispers carried on the wind through ruins long since devoured by the dust. And then there are names that erupt like fire from the stones themselves, demanding to be remembered, no matter how many centuries kings and chroniclers have tried to bury them. This is the story of a man born in chains, whose name was not his own, whose skin bore the welts of a master's whip, and yet who would rise, not merely to shatter those chains, but to bring an empire to its knees. In the dying light of a decaying century, when greed had rotted the sinews of the great imperial machine, he emerged from the underbelly of the provinces, a man forged in the furnace of humiliation, tempered in the heat of defiance. And in his defiance, there was no desperation, no frantic gamble for freedom. There was calculation, patience, and the cold, clear knowledge that the empire was not invincible. It is here, in the restless streets of a port city swollen with trade and misery, where our story begins. The air is heavy with the smell of salt and tar, mingled with the acrid smoke of cheap fires that burn all day and night. Slave markets hum with the murmured calculations of merchants measuring lives in coin. Soldiers patrol with the lazy menace of men who believe their authority eternal. Somewhere in the sprawling maze of alleys and shouting markets, a young man watches from the shadows, his gaze steady, his mind working in silence. He is nobody here, not yet, but the empire, though it does not know it, has already met its reckoning in his eyes. This is Candle and Coffin. Let's uncover the forgotten truth beneath the ashes of history. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing how far this story travels, long before the man who would one day be called a king took his first breath. The empire had already sown the seeds of its own undoing. It had stretched its borders too far, swallowing lands it neither understood nor respected, binding peoples of countless tongues and gods into one gilded cage in these outlying provinces, where the imperial banners hung like foreign omens. The empire's grip was felt most keenly not in the statues or temples it erected, but in the shackles and the tax ledgers it imposed. Here, in the coastal reaches far from the marble heart of the capital, men like him were commodities, cataloged alongside grain and livestock, bought and sold with the same impersonal efficiency. His mother had been taken in a raid, a village, torched, its survivors marched in chains to the auction block. His father, a shadow and a memory, was whispered to have been a warrior. But warriors without armies are merely prey, and prey seldom leave their names behind. The boy was born into the damp darkness of a storage room behind a merchant's house. His earliest lullabies the creak of ropes and the hiss of the sea against the docks. By the time he could walk, he could carry a bucket, and by the time he could carry a bucket, he could carry a crate. Strength came early, not as a gift, but as a necessity, the body's silent bargain with survival. And yet, even then, there was something about him that set him apart, a way he observed, absorbing the rhythms of the market, the roots of the guards, the weaknesses in the men who commanded him. His masters mistook his quiet for submission, but the truth was far more dangerous. Beneath the surface of his stoic silence, a map was being drawn, a map not of roads and harbors, but of opportunity and vengeance. He did not yet know how or when he would act, only that he would. And as the empire's reach continued to stretch, it did not see that, in one of its farthest corners, a spark had been lit that no amount of imperial might could extinguish. The first act of defiance was not a grand rebellion, nor the clash of swords in some sunlit square. It was a whisper in the dark, the kind of moment that history, in its hunger for spectacle, often overlooks. He was perhaps 17, his frame hardened by years of labor, his back a map of scars. That morning, the market had been restless. Rumors of unrest in the inland provinces had reached even the dockside stalls. Carried by traders with nervous eyes, merchants grumbled about the rising cost of security. Slavers tightened their grip on their wares. sensing the tremors of change. His task was simple: carry a shipment of salted fish to a warehouse near the northern pier. The crate was heavy, the air thick with the stench of brine and rot. But his mind was elsewhere. Along the route, he passed a group of chained men newly arrived from the hinterlands, tall, fierce-eyed, their wrists raw from the journey. The guards, bored and distracted, barked orders as they herded them toward the auction pen. In that instant, something passed between him and one of the captives. Not a word, not even a gesture, but a look, sharp, unflinching, as if both men recognized in the other the same truth. That night, while the city lay drunk on cheap wine, and the tide gnawed at the pilings, he crept to the warehouse where those men were kept. The lock was crude, the kind favored for temporary holding pens. The guards slept within earshot, but trusted the iron and their own authority. He worked in silence, the crude tool stolen from a shipwright's shed wrapped in cloth to mute their sound. When the lock yielded with a muffled click, the men inside stared at him, unsure if this was salvation or a trap. He said nothing, merely stepped back, motioning toward the shadows beyond the docks. By dawn, the captives were gone, melted into the labyrinth of the city or vanished to the hills beyond. The Empire never learned his name that night, but it would come to curse it in the years ahead. For him, this was not an act of mercy. It was the first move in a game he intended to play to the end. In empires, even the smallest ripple can disturb the still waters of control, and his quiet intervention at the docks had been more than a ripple. It was the faint but undeniable tremor of a coming storm. At first, there were only whispers, guards muttering about vanished slaves, merchants fuming over lost property, an overseer swearing he'd seen a shadow move where no man should have been. The authorities blamed incompetence, perhaps bribery, and doubled the watches along the piers. But in the underbelly of the city, where taverns reeked of smoke and sweat, the story changed in the telling. A nameless dock laborer had defied the chains. A ghost had passed through iron. Each retelling sharpened the edges, giving the deed a shape it had never fully possessed. And in doing so, it gave the man himself something far more dangerous than coin. It gave him myth. Yet myth is a blade with two edges. As his quiet reputation grew among the oppressed, so did the curiosity of those who thrived on order and fear. One morning, while unloading a cargo of amphora from a grain ship, he caught sight of a man watching him from the quay. Not a guard, not a merchant, but someone dressed in the muted leathers of the Imperial Scouts. Men tasked with sniffing out sedition before it could bloom. The stranger did not speak, did not approach, merely studied him with a calm, predatory stillness of one who knows the patience of a hunter. That night, the docksiders seemed thicker, the shadows deeper. He knew he had crossed an invisible threshold. The Empire did not yet know who he was, but it had begun to suspect that someone, somewhere, was willing to defy it, and suspicion, once born, never sleeps. The summons came not as a shout in the marketplace, but as a quiet hand on his shoulder. At dawn, two guards, neither in uniform, simply gestured for him to follow. There was no scene, no drawn swords, only the silent inevitability of a spider drawing in its prey. They led him through streets he had never walked, past the bustling docks and into the older quarters of the city, where the stones were slick with moss and the air smelled of damp rot. At the end of a narrow alley, a wooden door opened into a room lit by a single oil lamp. There, seated at a low table, was the man from the quay, the scout, his expression carved from something colder than stone. The questions came slowly, in a voice that seemed to carry neither threat nor mercy. Did he know anything of the escape? Captives? Had he seen strangers in the night near the warehouses? His answers were measured, not defiant, but never submissive. He spoke like a man with nothing to hide, which in itself was enough to make the scout's eyes narrow. Without warning, the scout reached into the shadows and produced a whip, not the long, ceremonial kind used in the squares, but a short, knotted cord meant to leave deep, precise wounds. The first strike was not for punishment, but for testing, as if gauging whether the man before him would break quickly or slowly. The pain was sharp, clean, and familiar. He did not cry out. A second strike followed, harder, drawing blood. The scout leaned close, so near that his breath brushed against the slave's ear, and said only one thing: "The Empire sees everything." Then he was released into the street, his back burning, his legs unsteady. It was not mercy. It was a warning, a mark placed upon him. But as he limped back toward the docks, he understood something the scout did not. Warnings are wasted on those who have already decided. They will not live quietly. Pain is a language, and he had learned to read it long before that day. The scout's whip had spoken plainly, not just of imperial authority, but of its fear. The need to remind the lowly of their place before they dared to step beyond it. But instead of carving submission into him, the lashes only deepened the lines of his resolve. Word of the encounter spread in ways the scout could not have intended. The docks have their own currents, and rumors there move faster than tides. By nightfall, the story had reached the mouths of sailors, fishmongers, and street hawkers. The dock laborer who had stood before the Empire's teeth and returned bloodied, but unbroken. For the enslaved and the poor, it was a dangerous kind of story. Dangerous because it suggested that resistance was possible, quietly. Faces began to linger a little longer when he passed. Hands found reasons to help him with a load or pass along a scrap of bread in the taverns and cramped backrooms of the port. Men and women who had nothing began to trade not just goods, but information: which guards could be bribed, which patrols grew lax at night, which ships carried soldiers, and which carried food. It was here, in the shadows cast by the Empire's own neglect, that his circle began to form, not an army yet, but a current gathering strength. Among them were freedmen with debts to settle, fishermen robbed by corrupt tax collectors, and even a disillusioned former soldier whose eyes carried the weight of too many pointless campaigns. They did not yet call him king, or even leader, but they began to follow him in the way that matters most, not with titles or oaths, but with quiet acts of loyalty. And somewhere beyond the city walls, the men he had freed that night in the warehouse were beginning to whisper his name. The first true strike was not aimed at soldiers or governors, but at the veins through which the Empire's lifeblood flowed, its supply lines. For all its grandeur and legions, the Empire was a beast that could not live without grain, and the docks were where the grain arrived from the fertile provinces to feed both the garrisons and the swelling cities. He had studied the rhythms for years without realizing it, the times when the barges came in from the river, the handover between the watch on the quay and the warehouse guards, the moments of chaos when crates and sacks were counted, cursed over, and misplaced. It began with a single shipment, 3 wagons laden with sacks of barley, marked for the barracks on the eastern wall. The plan was simple, the execution silent. 2 men in his growing circle posed as hired porters, their forged tokens enough to convince a distracted foreman in the dark before dawn. The wagons rolled not toward the barracks, but toward the maze of alleys where sympathetic hands waited. By sunrise, the grain had vanished, redistributed among the poor, the slaves, the outcast fishermen who now owed their next meal not to the Empire, but to him. The theft itself was small, barely enough to inconvenience the garrison. But the message was enormous. The Empire could be touched. Its reach could be turned against it. When the foreman discovered the loss, he beat to innocent porters bloody and swore he'd hang the thieves. But no one spoke. Silence became its own rebellion, a wall the Empire could not scale. And in that silence, his myth swelled further. No longer just a dock worker who had freed a handful of captives, but a figure who could steal from the Emperor's own granaries and feed the people the Empire left to starve. It was a strike not just at the stomach of the beast, but at its illusion of control. The Empire, slow to act but relentless once stirred. began to tighten its net. Word of missing grain reached the governor, a man who had long believed fear and routine were sufficient to keep the provinces in line. He dispatched patrols, not merely to search for stolen provisions, but to unearth the source of this audacity, the phantom who had turned the Empire's own mechanisms against it. Soldiers moved in columns through the alleys, their boots clattering against cobblestones, lanterns swinging, eyes searching every shadow. Yet the city's labyrinth favored those who knew it, and he moved like smoke, slipping unseen past the soldiers, leaving only whispers of movement and the faint scent of oil lamps. Extinguished in his passing, for the first time, the men in his circle began to face the true weight of what they were becoming part of. They were no longer just petty thieves or rebels. They were fugitives hunted by the full machinery of an empire. The night air carried the tension like static, and even those who had once doubted his vision could feel the pull of history gathering around them. Each encounter with patrols was a lesson in survival and strategy. Misdirect the pursuers, leave false trails, and never, ever leave footprints in predictable patterns. And while the Empire sought him with its soldiers and spies, he was shaping himself, honing his mind like a blade, learning not just how to survive, but how to strike with precision. The docks, the alleys, the warehouses, all became chess pieces in a game that the Empire did not yet realize it was losing. His name was still unknown to those who sought it, but in the hearts of the oppressed, the whispers were growing. There was someone among them who could not be controlled, who would not bend, and who, if history was fair, would change everything. The first ambush was born from careful observation and patience, the hallmarks of a strategist hidden among the enslaved and forgotten. He chose a narrow supply route just outside the city, where imperial wagons carrying silver and provisions from the hinterlands, slow to navigate the uneven cobblestones and rickety wooden bridges. It was here, in the hush of pre-dawn, that he and a small group of his followers struck, not with reckless fury, but with calculated precision. A barricade of overturned carts, ropes tied to trip the horses, and the careful placement of nets to ensnare any who might resist. The guards, seasoned men of the Empire, were caught off guard, not by force alone, but by the intelligence behind it. Every step of their route had been studied, every patrol pattern memorized. In the chaos, the wagon's contents were seized and redistributed, first to the starving outskirts of the city, then to secret caches hidden in the hills beyond, ensuring his allies could sustain themselves without immediate detection. The ambush left no unnecessary bloodshed. The goal was not cruelty, but disruption, and even the Empire's men recognized the skill behind the act, whispering rumors of a shadow that moved with uncanny foresight. By the time the governor received the report, panic had begun to ripple through the provincial administration. It was no longer a simple theft or a minor rebellion. A pattern had emerged, deliberate and insidious, a hand that knew the Empire's arteries and was beginning to throttle them quietly, efficiently, and with growing audacity. And in the shadows of the city and hills alike, the enslaved and oppressed began to see the shape of possibility. The man who had once carried crates and swept docks was no longer a servant of the Empire, but a master of its weaknesses. And the legend of the slave king was beginning to breathe in the open air. By now, the Empire could no longer dismiss the rising threat as mere petty crime. The subtle strikes had grown into a pattern that demanded a response. The governor, a man who prided himself on order and obedience, petitioned the Imperial Council for elite reinforcements, soldiers not only trained in combat, but schooled in strategy, tracking, and subterfuge. These were the Empire's shadows, disciplined, relentless, and ruthless. They arrived in the city under the cover of night, moving like wraiths through the narrow alleys, their presence a silent declaration that the state had taken notice. He, however, had anticipated this escalation through his network of informants, fishermen, merchants, and dock hands who owed him their lives. He knew where the soldiers would patrol, how they would move, and what their blind spots were. And so he adapted, turning the very streets themselves into instruments of resistance. Barrels of oil to create smoke screens, hidden rope traps to disarm pursuers, and false trails to send them chasing ghosts through the labyrinthine city. Each encounter with the elite patrols was a test of wits as much as strength. When a small squad cornered him near the eastern quay, he did not fight immediately. He misled them into thinking he was trapped, then struck with a suddenness so precise that one guard fell into the water, another disarmed, and the rest fled in confusion. With every victory, his legend grew, whispered in taverns and back alleys, emboldening those who had long endured the Empire's oppression. Yet with every success came the inescapable truth: the Empire would not relent. These were not ordinary men he was opposing, but the calculated machinery of a state that had conquered continents, and every victory carried the weight of inevitable retribution. He understood this, and it steeled him, sharpening not only his strategy, but the resolve of those who had chosen to follow him into the shadows where the Empire dared not fully tread. As his victories multiplied, the story of the slave king spread far beyond the confines of the city, carried by word of mouth, secret letters, and the clandestine networks of merchants and travelers who dared to defy imperial censorship. In distant villages and provincial towns, those who had long suffered under heavy taxes, brutal overseers, and endless conscription began to see in him a symbol of what was possible. Not just survival, but resistance. Quiet acts of rebellion began to erupt spontaneously. Wagons left mysteriously unguarded, supplies redirected, minor officials embarrassed and punished by unseen hands. These small, almost imperceptible tremors shook the Empire's foundations, sowing fear among the very administrators who had once considered themselves untouchable. Within the city itself, his influence expanded as more men and women joined his circle, drawn not by promises of gold, but by a shared conviction that the Empire's authority was neither eternal nor absolute. Among them were scholars who had studied the Empire's legal and logistical systems, former soldiers with intimate knowledge of troop movements, and skilled artisans capable of forging weapons, tools, and disguises. Every new member brought knowledge, every act of loyalty, a ripple that extended the reach of his rebellion. And while he avoided grand gestures of defiance that would draw immediate imperial retaliation, he began orchestrating coordinated strikes that undermined the Empire's control over trade, communications, and taxation. Each success was calculated, precise, leaving no trace except the whisper of a name that struck fear and hope in equal measure. The slave king, even the imperial scouts, who had once underestimated him, began to record his movements, marking a man they could neither predict nor trap, and yet were compelled to follow, knowing that one misstep could allow his influence to spread like wildfire across the provinces. The Empire's attention, once indifferent, had sharpened into obsession, and in this growing tension, a greater reckoning was quietly approaching. The next phase of his rebellion required audacity and careful orchestration. Small acts of theft and ambush no longer sufficed. He began targeting the Empire's infrastructure directly, striking at supply lines, granaries, and communication networks that allowed imperial control to reach even the most distant provinces. With the help of his followers, he mapped the arteries of the Empire like a surgeon studying a body, noting weaknesses, choke points, and vulnerabilities hidden in plain sight. One night, a convoy carrying weapons and provisions to a fortified garrison was redirected into the marshes. Outside the city, horses became mired in mud, crates overturned, and supplies confiscated for redistribution among the starving communities. Elsewhere, messengers carrying imperial orders found their routes blocked or their couriers intercepted, leaving commanders confused and ill-informed. These actions, small individually, but cumulatively devastating, began to erode the Empire's confidence in its ability to maintain control. Yet with every strike, He also demonstrated restraint, no unnecessary bloodshed. No wanton destruction, only calculated precision that revealed not cruelty, but mastery over strategy. This combination of brilliance and morality made him a legend among the oppressed and a ghostly nightmare for the Empire. Rumors of his presence spread further. Merchants swore they had seen him vanish into walls. Soldiers reported hearing whispers in the wind guiding their prey, and administrators whispered of a man who seemed to anticipate every move they made. Each action sharpened his followers' skills, instilled loyalty, and created the first glimmers of a coordinated resistance that could rival the Empire's forces. And while the Empire scrambled to respond, sending reinforcements and spies in increasingly desperate measures, he remained one step ahead, a shadow weaving through the Empire's own machinery, teaching the world that even a slave could become the master of destiny. The reverberations of his defiance began to reach far beyond the city's walls, stirring unrest in provinces long considered loyal and docile, across rivers and mountains, and villages and towns chafing under heavy taxes. The oppressed began whispering the name of the man who had dared to strike the Empire and lived to tell the tale. Farmers left hidden supplies for rebels, miners sabotaged transport routes, and small garrisons found themselves abandoned or misdirected by local sympathizers. Letters and symbols, simple but unmistakable, marked safe houses and meeting points, creating a covert network that extended the reach of his influence like a web spun in secrecy. His message was clear. The Empire's power was not absolute, its reach not omnipotent, and even the lowliest could shape history with cunning and courage. Governors grew anxious, suspecting conspiracies where there were none, while imperial. Soldiers reported strange patterns, wagons disappearing, communication lines severed. Patrols misled, all pointing to a presence that seemed to anticipate their every move. Meanwhile, his followers swelled not merely in numbers but in expertise. Artisans forged weapons from scraps, scouts mapped terrain with precision, and former soldiers shared knowledge of tactics once reserved for the Emperor's generals. These scattered sparks of rebellion, each seemingly minor in isolation, began to form a constellation of unrest, and the Empire's attention was drawn not to isolated disturbances, but to the growing pattern of coordinated defiance within the shadows of these provinces. He became more than a man. He became an idea, a symbol of the possibility that even the most rigid empire could be shaken, that a single, determined soul could ignite the fires of rebellion across a continent. The Empire, alarmed by the spreading unrest and the audacity of the man they had once dismissed as a mere nuisance, mobilized a full-scale response. Entire legions were redirected from peaceful provinces to patrol rebellious territories, their banners and armor meant to remind all who saw them of the Empire's unassailable might. Governors issued draconian edicts, demanding loyalty under threat of execution, while spies and informants infiltrated towns, farms, and workshops, searching for the invisible hand that had orchestrated chaos from the shadows. Yet, for every force the Empire deployed, he had already anticipated its arrival. Scouts and sympathizers provided precise intelligence on troop movements, fortifications, and weaknesses, allowing him to orchestrate diversions, sabotage, and ambushes that crippled the Imperial advance without ever risking the lives of his growing army unnecessarily. Grain convoys were rerouted into marshes, bridges subtly sabotaged, and garrisons found their orders delayed or falsified, leaving them exposed and confused. His tactics were not brute force but psychological mastery. He turned the Empire's own discipline and reliance on structure against it, creating confusion, hesitation, and fear where before there had been certainty. The oppressed, emboldened by his careful and effective strikes, began to rise in pockets of resistance, each action coordinated yet independent, a testament to the networks he had quietly built. Letters carried warnings, signs marked safe routes, and local leaders who once bowed to imperial command now found themselves covertly rallying citizens. In preparation for coordinated acts of defiance, the empire's military might, vast and terrifying in theory, began to falter in practice, encountering an enemy who was as elusive as he was clever, and whose knowledge of terrain, loyalty, and human psychology far surpassed the rigid strategies of imperial command. In this growing storm, the man once born into chains was no longer a slave. He was a strategist, a commander, and the embodiment of resistance that would not be contained. As his campaign of defiance widened, the empire began to fracture not only along the battlefields but within its own corridors of power. Governors whispered accusations of incompetence, generals pointed fingers at one another, and advisors debated endlessly over strategies that seemed to fail at every turn, every delay, every loss of supply. Every unexpected uprising stirred dissent, and soon the emperor himself could not ignore the growing pattern of chaos. Courtiers feared that acknowledging the slave king's brilliance might embolden even the most loyal subjects to question authority, while provincial leaders feared that their own regions might erupt in revolt if they were perceived as weak. Within this volatile environment, factions formed, some advocating ruthless suppression, others caution and diplomacy, yet all agreed on one point: the man who had risen from nothing could not be ignored. Meanwhile, his own influence continued to swell. Disillusioned soldiers defected, carrying knowledge of imperial drills, codes, and weak points. Merchants and sailors smuggled supplies and intelligence to his hidden forces, and the oppressed, previously resigned to their chains, began to coordinate local uprisings that created simultaneous pressure points across the empire. Each victory, no matter how small, fed not just practical gains but psychological ones: fear in the halls of power, hope in the alleys, and a growing legend that transcended the man himself. Even as the empire deployed greater forces and sent its most trusted scouts, spies, and generals to track him down, they began to realize that their enemy was no longer merely an individual, but a movement, a living shadow spreading across the empire, turning its own weaknesses into weapons. And in this delicate balance, the man who had been born a slave now moved like a king among the oppressed, orchestrating a rebellion that threatened to undo centuries of imperial control, piece by piece, without ever revealing the full extent of his hand. The first major confrontation with the empire came not by accident, but by design. A battle meticulously planned with patience, intelligence, and an unerring understanding of human nature. Imperial forces, confident in their numbers and the experience of their commanders, marched to crush what they believed was a scattered rebellion, a nuisance easily extinguished. But he had studied their formations, their timings, and even the arrogance of their officers. Using the terrain to his advantage, he lured the imperial detachment into a narrow valley, flanked by steep hills and thick groves that masked the movements of his hidden forces. When the trap was sprung, the chaos was instantaneous. Soldiers were caught in ambush from multiple directions, their formations crumbling as his men, previously indistinguishable from the landscape, descended upon them with precise strikes. Fire was set along strategic points to block retreat and disorient the enemy. Signals passed silently among his captains ensured that each maneuver complemented the others, leaving the imperial forces divided and vulnerable. The battle, though swift by the standards of grand campaigns, was devastating in its efficiency. Casualties were high, not through cruelty, but through the perfection of strategy, a demonstration of the consequences of underestimating the underestimated. Word of the victory spread like wildfire, reinforcing the mythos of the slave king as a man who could not only evade the empire's reach but decisively strike against it, reshaping the balance of power in a single engagement. Meanwhile, the empire, stunned and humiliated, scrambled to understand the anomaly. A force so small, and yet so lethal, orchestrated by a man who had risen from chains to command the tide of events itself. In this triumph, he and his followers tasted not only victory, but the intoxicating awareness that their actions could shake the foundations of an empire. and that the impossible, the undoing of centuries of oppression, was now within reach. The empire, humiliated and enraged by its first major defeat at the hands of a man born in chains, began to resort to desperate measures, employing both force and treachery to contain the growing rebellion. Governors offered large bounties for his capture, promising freedom, wealth, and position to anyone who could deliver him into imperial hands. Spies infiltrated his ranks, attempting to sow mistrust among his followers, planting rumors of betrayal and disloyalty that threatened to fracture the fragile unity he had painstakingly built. Even the most disciplined soldiers found themselves tempted by bribes, coerced into betraying comrades or revealing crucial information. The threat of betrayal weighed heavily upon him, forcing constant vigilance. Every messenger, every new ally, and even every familiar face became a potential source of danger. And yet, he adapted, turning the Empire's own tactics against it. False defections were staged to mislead spies, and misinformation campaigns diverted enemy troops into traps and ambushes. He used psychological warfare to keep Imperial commanders off balance, leaking rumors of attacks that never came, manipulating the fear of the unknown as effectively as any sword. Simultaneously, his followers learned the value of loyalty and discipline, each act of obedience reinforced by the shared victories and mutual dependence that bound them together. Amid the tension of espionage, deception, and constant threat, his movement hardened, not just in skill, but in trust, a network of rebels who understood that betrayal would be met not with vengeance alone, but with strategic mastery. In these shadowed struggles, the Slave King's legend grew in the whispers of both friend and foe, a figure who was as elusive as he was brilliant, proving that even within the suffocating reach of an empire, cunning, courage, and unbreakable unity could carve out a path to freedom. With the Empire's forces stretched thin and its authority weakened by repeated setbacks, he turned his attention to a greater, more audacious goal: uniting the scattered rebellions and discontented factions across the provinces into a coordinated front. No longer would acts of resistance remain isolated and piecemeal. He envisioned a network that could strike simultaneously, overwhelming the Empire's ability to respond. To accomplish this, he sent trusted envoys, former soldiers, merchants, and freed slaves to distant towns and villages, carrying carefully crafted messages of solidarity, strategy, and hope. These emissaries spoke not only of his victories but of a vision, a world in which the oppressed would no longer bow to the arbitrary cruelty of distant rulers, a world in which justice and survival were reclaimed by those who had been forgotten. Slowly, leaders of smaller rebellions agreed to align under his banner, their local knowledge, manpower, and resources combining into a formidable coalition. He held councils in secret locations, often in abandoned fortresses, caves, and hidden valleys, where strategies were debated, routes were planned, and intelligence meticulously verified. Each faction contributed not only soldiers but spies, artisans, and navigators, creating a multifaceted force capable of simultaneous operations over vast distances. The Empire, now recognizing the scale of the threat, intensified its campaigns. Yet every move it made seemed anticipated. Every strategy countered by intelligence gathered from the network he had carefully cultivated. As the coalition grew, so did the myth of the Slave King, a man who had risen from chains to forge unity from chaos, who transformed scattered despair into a coordinated force that no imperial decree could easily suppress. And in this moment, the balance of power, long assumed immutable, began to tilt in ways that neither emperor nor general could have foreseen, signaling the dawn of a rebellion that would shake the foundations of the empire itself. The moment of reckoning arrived when the Slave King set his sights on a major imperial stronghold, a fortified city that had long symbolized the empire's unassailable power in the region. Its walls, thick and cold, had repelled countless sieges, and within its gates resided not only soldiers but bureaucrats, merchants, and officials who enforced the empire's will with ruthless efficiency. Yet he approached not with arrogance, but with the precision of a master strategist who had studied every detail, from troop rotations to supply chains, from the hidden aqueducts to secret passages used by smugglers and couriers. For weeks, his coalition of rebel forces conducted careful reconnaissance, mapping the terrain, memorizing guard shifts, and coordinating signals between distant groups. Then, on the night of the assault, chaos became his weapon. Fire was set in control points along the outskirts to draw troops from the walls. Diversions led patrols into traps, and covert teams infiltrated through hidden tunnels to open gates and create internal confusion. The fighting was brutal and intimate, the clash of steel, the cries of the wounded, and the roar of the emboldened rebels filled the night air. Yet amidst the carnage, he remained a calm, commanding presence, orchestrating movements with a clarity and foresight that belied the chaos around him. By dawn, the imperial stronghold had fallen, not merely through brute force, but through strategy, unity, and the unbreakable resolve of a man who had once been a slave. The victory was decisive and symbolic. It demonstrated that the empire could be beaten, not only on the field but in its heart, that its mighty walls were vulnerable, and that a leader forged from oppression could outmaneuver an empire built on centuries of conquest. Across the provinces, the news traveled swiftly, igniting hope and fear in equal measure. Hope for the oppressed, fear for the rulers. The slave king had achieved the impossible. He had struck a blow that would be remembered as a turning point, a testament to the power of courage, strategy, and the relentless pursuit of justice against overwhelming odds. The dust of the battlefield settled, leaving behind a city forever changed and an empire forced to reckon with a truth it had long denied. Power, no matter how absolute it appears, is never immune to courage, cunning, and the will of those who refuse to be broken. The slave king, once born into chains and cruelty, now stood as a figure larger than life, a symbol of defiance that transcended his mortal existence. Yet even in victory, he understood the fragility of triumph. The empire's reach was long, its vengeance patient, and the work of resistance never truly complete. In quiet moments, he reflected on the men and women who had followed him, those who had sacrificed everything for a cause that was bigger than any one life. And he knew that the greatest victories were not measured in conquered cities or seized granaries, but in the freedom and hope rekindled in hearts long subdued by oppression. The lessons of his journey were etched into every scar, every whispered legend, every strategy that had turned chains into swords. Courage is contagious, unity is powerful, and even the smallest spark can ignite a fire that topples empires. And though the slave king himself would fade into history, his name lived on in the memory of those who had dared to rise, a haunting testament to the possibilities born from defiance.